Welcome everybody to day 2 of the RWL 12 conference. There has been a session before this, the graduate student meetup, and it seemed like it went very well. But what we're here today to do is to hear from our second keynote. My role is to help with the question and answer period after the presentation, and just simply to introduce the introducer of our keynote speaker. So in that regard, I'm pleased to introduce you to Sheldon Bromfield. He's another of the shining lights of our graduate program in work and learning and social change here at the University of Toronto. He actually just graduated with his doctoral degree a month or so ago. Congratulations, Dr. Bromfield, again. And he is also featured in our Work, Learning, and Social Change Emerging Voices online interview series that can be seen or accessed through the book fair materials you've all been sent as registrants. So with that as a bit of an introduction to the introducer, I turn it over to Sheldon to say a few words about our second keynote speaker. Sheldon?
Thanks, Peter. Welcome, everyone. My name is Sheldon Bromfield. I'm a recently graduated PhD from the University of Toronto, Adult Education and Community Development Program, specializing in workplace learning and social change. And I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you today our second keynote speaker of the RWL 12 Toronto International Conference, Professor Hongxia Shan, Associate Professor of Adult Education and Learning at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. Professor Shan's research focuses on work, learning, knowledge, transfer, and translation in the context of immigration, globalization, and transnationalism. Her work has appeared widely in leading national and international journals. She is a former president of the Canadian Association for the Study of Adult Education. She has served as an expert / keynote speaker and discussant in a large range of both academic and professional conferences, nationally and internationally, addressing such themes as migration, work, adult learning, and social equity and justice. She is also a former graduate of the University of Toronto herself. And so here I extend a virtual welcome home to. Her keynote speech today is entitled Translating Immigrant Advantage, Career Stories of Engineering Professionals in Canada. I'd ask the international audience to join me in extending their best welcoming thoughts to her over the internet. And without further delay, Professor Hongxia Shan.
Thank you very much, Sheldon. I'm going to get myself organized first. I assume the screen is appearing up all right? Perfect. Great, thank you. Well, thank you very much for the generous introduction on Sheldon, or Dr. Sheldon Bromfield, and congratulations on completing your program. It's a huge achievement. And yes, I'm a proud OISE alumnus, and it is great to be back, although virtually only. Greetings to my professors, friends, and as people in East Asia would put it, academic brothers and sisters at OISE, and of course, all the conference participants, wherever you are. I was looking at the program for the conference, and there are so many more people who I think are more qualified than I am to be the keynote speaker today. But as you can see, I do have the home advantage here. So in any case, I really appreciate the conference organizing committee for all the work and for extending this opportunity and platform for me to share some of my work. Now I want to start by acknowledging the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people on which I live, work, and deliver this talk. Vancouver is a beautiful place, and today is a really sunny and warm day. But it is also a place scarred with historical trauma, and so is the entire Canada, I would assume. So I am still searching for my relationship to land, which requires a lot of learning about the history, the people, and the place. And this has been and will remain a journey of humility for me personally and professionally. Now, when I started out doing research at OISE 20 years ago, as a new immigrant myself, I was interested in how immigrants learn to navigate the wholesale labor market. And over time, I have come to see that it is quite problematic to focus on immigrants' learning experiences only, because it does risk fixing immigrants to the subject position as lifelong learners. So in my continued research with immigrants, it becomes increasingly obvious that immigrants are far from learners per se. They're also knowledge translators, practice innovators, and shakers and movers across professions. So today I'm going to focus on immigrants as knowledge translators in this talk. Now, transnational migrants are often positioned as boundary spanners, knowledge brokers, and knowledge spillover agents. Managerial and organizational studies, for instance, have documented how expatriates help forge social, cultural, and knowledge networks through intra-company movements. And migrant and development studies have also highlighted the crucial roles that return migrants play in knowledge transfer, technological innovation, social and monetary remittance, and economic development in general in their host country, in their home countries. So in contrast to all the limelight shed on expatriate elites and return migrants, with few exceptions, rarely has research addressed immigrants as knowledge transfer agents in the West. So this dearth of research on immigrants and knowledge transfer is perhaps due to the preoccupation of immigrant researchers with a much more immediate issue, and that is the systematic under and unemployment of immigrants. Regardless, this asymmetrical literature on migration and knowledge transfer is problematic. In particular, it serves to entrench the image of the West as the epistemic center of the world, where universal and authoritative knowledge originates. So in this talk, I'm going to address this issue by sharing the experiences of immigrants, particularly immigrant engineers, transferring and translating knowledge in the profession in Canada. So here is my agenda. I will first introduce the existing work on knowledge transfer in relation to the context of migration. I will then introduce a context of skilled migration in Canada and related research and dominant concerns in those studies. I will then propose a practice-based ontology of knowledge transfer before speaking briefly about my research methodology and research. I'll then illustrate my conceptual proposal of knowledge transfer using the career stories of 3 immigrant engineers, and before I end with a discussion of the implications of my work. So you can see it's a typical research presentation that you're attending here. I'm just going to move on to the context of knowledge transfer in the context of migration. Now, before anything else, I do need to say that the term of knowledge transfer to some extent undercuts its own potency as a focus of research. It easily evokes a sense of realism, conjuring the image of friction-free, unidirectional movement of a real substance Here I'm quoting from Garadi and Nicolini, that can be sent, received, circulated, transferred, accumulated, converted, and stored. So this image is evident across migration and development studies, organizational studies, as well as researching adult learning and education. So in all three fields, the predominant interests are in the factors, processes, resources, media, conditions, and most importantly, the outcome of knowledge transfer. So models of transfer have been built at multiple levels, including the individual, the intra-organizational, the inter-organizational, regional, and the transnational. So together, questions of transfer are asked regarding what is being transferred in relation to the context of origin and the context of application, just to determine whether and how transfer transpired. Now, while the subjects addressed in studies of knowledge transfer come from diverse backgrounds, few studies address relationships between social identities and knowledge transfer. Mobile individuals are typically concerned or constructed as agentic and yet generic subjects moving or transitioning between two or more cultures and contexts. And the efforts to identify what is transferred have also converged in the rise of various typologies of knowledge, and many such efforts are influenced directly or indirectly by Polanyi's distinction between explicit and tacit knowledge. Now, in the context of migration, for example, Alan Williams, one of the few researchers theorizing in the area of knowledge transfer and migration, draws on 5 images of knowledge that Blackler identified in organizational studies. So these are in-brain knowledge, embodied knowledge, embedded knowledge, encultured knowledge, and encoded knowledge. So according to Williams, in-brain and embodied knowledge, which are supposedly encapsulated in individuals, are transferable through corporeal migratory movement. On the other hand, encultured knowledge and embedded knowledge are transferred only in truncated forms as they are socially situated. The problem, though, as Blackler pointed out already, whether it is a sensible exercise to consider knowledge as discrete things with particular locus of existence, be it the brain, the body, the system, or the symbolic. Now, the few research projects that position immigrants as agents of knowledge transfer in the West also tend to take a realist approach to knowledge. Just to give you some examples here, Saxenian shows that the social, cultural, and institutional knowledge that immigrant IT professionals in Silicon Valley have about their home countries, as well as the additional language that they speak, can be turned into business advantage that benefit both the home and host countries. And Berger and Tolberg's study of IT professionals from India working in the Netherlands makes a distinction between codified and tacit knowledge. And the argument is that the former, codified knowledge seems to be moving relatively easily across place, and the latter, tacit knowledge, need to be developed through immersion within cultural context. Now, there's one study that's different from the rest, I would say, Iskander and Lowe's study of construction workers from Mexico, I think, departs from the realist paradigm of knowledge. So the authors argue that knowledge, specifically tacit knowledge, is not an asset acquired through accretion. Rather, each time the workers invoke their tacit knowledge in their new workplaces, they also make new cognitive connections and hence transform the very knowledge itself. Now, in my work, I also hope to part ways with a realist paradigm of knowledge transfer. So instead of looking at types of knowledge that immigrants bring with them, I focus on knowledge transfer as a continuous process of translation within people's everyday work. And in my study of knowledge transfer, I also hope to center issues of social identities, which have been a side of struggle, as I will demonstrate, for skilled immigrants. Now, the social backgrounds of immigrants have always mattered in the Canadian immigration history, at least, and influence of their labor market outcomes. Previously, Canadian immigration policies consistently gave preference to white, male, European descent to the exclusion and marginalization of people from other origins. So in the 1960s, Canada ended the overtly gendered and racialized practices and started targeting skilled immigrants with desired educational and work experiences. And in the last decade also, new pathways and programs of immigration have also been created to attract the people, including international students, to come to and stay in Canada. So today, immigrants make up a high proportion of the skilled labor force in Canada, particularly in the STEM professions, including engineering. In 2016, immigrants aged between 25 and 64 make up 78.7% of all individuals in engineering, trained in engineering with a bachelor degree and above, with India, China, and the Philippines being the top countries of origin, followed by the US, the UK, Iran, Pakistan, and Romania, and in that order. In contrast, immigrants make up 48.3% of those employed in engineering, and there's also a 28.2% of earning gap between immigrants and Canadian-born engineering workers after controlling for differences such as age, gender, language, and visible minority status. Now, research has long grappled with the issue of gender and unemployment facing immigrants, particularly immigrants from racialized backgrounds. Much of the research focuses on issues that immigrants face in the labor market, which range from individual barriers such as language to institutional exclusion and racism. So the dominant discourse is that immigrant success in the labor market depends on the forms and levels of cultural capitals, human capital skills, and social capitals and networks that they have accumulated, as well as the extent to which these capitals and skills are validated and recognized in the wholesale labor market. So within this dominant discourse, immigrants are largely positioned as either the deficit others or as Williams calls replacement knowledge bearers, who are expected to fit into the existing knowledge and skill structures in the wholesale societies. An increasing number of studies have called out the dominant institutions for misrecognition, whether it is about the existing system not being able to recognize the others within particular fields of practice, or about them denying the common humanity of the others. Now, on the other hand, there's also a recognition that the differences that immigrant bring can be and have been mobilized to improve immigrants' career opportunities. In particular, studies have highlighted that immigrants accrue transnational social and cultural capitals that they deploy to improve their career and economic opportunities across place. So together, these studies point to mechanism of validation for what Ariel calls migration-specific capitals as a result of immigrants' negotiation of positionalities across place. And these mechanisms build on rather than simply reproduce the power relations of existing home and host countries. So based on this body of literature, it is clear that given the social and cultural and geographic distances that immigrants traverse, they do develop ways of knowing, doing, relating, and likely being that are different from non-immigrant cohorts or counterparts, which constitute a positional advantage that could be potentially activated to expand existing practices across professions. Now, while we know that recognition is important for immigrants to leverage their positional advantage, recognition alone may not be the sole conditions for this to happen. There is, however, a lack of understanding of the process through which some immigrants are enabled to bring forth the differences and distinctions as positional advantage in the host labor market. So I hope to contribute to this gap of literature from the perspective of knowledge transfer as translation. Now here comes my conceptual, let's say, heuristic. Now the proposal of knowledge transfer as translation is premised on a dynamic notion of knowledge. So rather than treating knowledge as discrete things or objects, by referring to what Shasky broadly referred to as a practice term, I see knowledge as a continuous process of production, and this process of production, as Blackler puts it, is mediated, situated, provisional, pragmatic, and likely contested. And this idea resonates with Geraghty's use of knowing in practice, which frames knowledge as something that people do together. And to some extent, this conception also benefits from the image of rhizome, which Deleuze and Guattari propose as an alternative metaphor to understand the compilation of knowledge. So according to them, a rhizome has no beginning or end. It's always in the middle, between things, interbeing, intermezzo. So with the use of rhizome, Deleuze and Guattari suggest that knowledge is a horizontal and reticulated system of rules with multiple nodes of connectivities. So in other words, knowledge involves the coming together of a multitude of entities, matters, minds, regimes of science, organization power, and social struggles. So in the formulation of unique alliances or a collective assemblage of enunciation. So when knowledge is considered as a process of assemblage, knowledge transfer becomes the effect of one's translation into the assemblage. My use of the term of translation is derived directly from socio-material approaches to practice, which posit that the world is a dynamic system performed into being through the moment-to-moment interactions of heterogeneous entities, both human and non-human. Actor network theory, also known as the sociology of translation, originated from studies of sciences and technologies. It was constructed to trace, I would say, the exterior relations through which human and non-human beings become associated in primary ways. So from this perspective, not all entities are visible or active until enrolled within the network where they assume roles, perform knowledge, and exert forces. So when entities come together, they exercise agency by, here I'm quoting from Fenwick, Edwards, and Sawchuk, working upon one another to translate or train to become part of a network of coordinated things which behaves in particular ways. So the process of translation can be nuanced, it can be incremental, can be delayed, can be partial. And at each node of association, there's typically negotiation and sometimes intense negotiation of knowing, being, doing, place, position, and power. So in this negotiation process, objects, I argue, may also assume particular roles and identities and become agentic. So indeed, from the socio-material perspectives, entities of all natures are believed to be in constant process of becoming. So this idea, the idea is that as entity is translated into assemblage or network where it functions differently, it may exhibit different properties. So when considering objects, if you think of text, tools, signs, and symbols in relation to knowledge translation and knowledge production in general, Susan Starr's conception of boundary objects and Karen Noor-Satna's epistemic objects, I think, become really useful reference points. So the notion of boundary objects refers to representational forms, including things and theories that are shared across communities. Different communities may interpret the object differently, and yet those objects make it possible for different communities to cooperate despite the absence of consensus. Now, Noor-Satna's epistemic objects also suggest that objects are processes and projections rather than definitive things, and they exist in their incompleteness and acquire their identities as they appear in relation to interpretive human beings. So in other words, the argument is that the objects, again, tools, signs, technologies, are endowed with interpretive flexibility, and the meaning and identity that they acquire are derived from their enactment within practices. Now, if objects are agentic in the translation of knowledge, human beings have to be key actors in the process of translation. So to understand how individuals translate themselves and become translated into a knowledge practice is not enough to capture the exterior relationality through which an event of knowledge transfer is assembled. It is also important to have I would say, a good understanding of the genetic formation of identities, because they are the ground on which individuals organize ourselves in action. So in this regard, I'm drawn in particular to Holland and Leib's idea of history in person. So informed by the work of Bakhtin, Mead, and Vygotsky, history in person approaches identity as a dialogical and development process. And this perspective centers the dialogues or inner speeches over differences between the self and the internalized versions of the other. Now, Holland and Leib argue that this inner speech is a product of the disproportionate distribution of material and symbolic resources, which constitute the basis or the resources for individuals to position themselves. So in other words, history in person is likely to have its own agenda and momentum. And in the meantime, the inner speech is also an ongoing dialogue within coordinated and ongoing activities that are culturally and discursively mediated. So as people move through and between practices across spaces, they will be subjected to multiple cultural and symbolic resources, which means that that identity is bound to be simultaneously historical and open and shifting, multiple, and constantly negotiated. Now, related to identities is the issue of social and power differences, which is not a typical concern in studies of knowledge transfer either. So in traditional social and educational research, issues of power are often approached from the lens of social differences, such as class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, disability, age, and so on. So presumably, people on the privileged side of the line possess power, and people on the other side are the dispossessed and oppressed. Although the scholarship on intersectionality have really complexified the picture for us. In this possessive and distributive view, to some extent, power is a sort of a zero-sum game. You either have it or not. So practice theory, I think, do not typically take individual and group differences for granted, and they instead direct attention to the organization of human activities through which differences are enacted, produced, and become consequential. Now, Brenner Latour, one of the end person, is sympathetic to the distributive notion of power and sees it as useful in helping us understand the genealogy of people's positions, where people come from, which are with us till today. Now, in the meantime, he also argues that power is not the cause of action, but the consequences of it. So his translation model of power shows that power is not what one does to another. It is rather something that is worked down or worked up within a chain of actions where each actor shapes it as it circulates. So in this view, he also argues that power is produced by enrolling actors in a given political and social scheme. So his translation model directs attention to power, I think, as it is modified and performed in practice. So in my work, I want to bring together both the distributive and performative approaches to power so that I can attend to the historical struggles of groups at the same time, not to lose sight of the roles individual beings play in effecting changes within practices. Now I'm going to move on to the research and share a few methodological notes, perhaps. I do want to say that in the past 20 years, I have spoken to around 120 practicing engineers who came to Canada as immigrants through different research projects. But the last two projects that I conducted, both supported by SSHRC, focus on immigrant engineers' experiences in Canada in terms of professional learning and knowledge transfer, respectively. And there are lots of common findings across those two projects. So for both projects, I use a life history style interviews following how individuals build their own career world in their own words, with particular attention paid to the significant events in their career histories. And then situational analysis. This is a method that I use for my second project, but I'm also applying it retroactively to the first project too. So situational analysis is used to understand the constitution of the events that people related, where they have brought changes and impacts within the profession. So in practice, the analysis followed questions such as who and what are in this situation, who and what matters in this situation, what elements made a difference, and how are the elements related to one another. And later on, I also tried to identify what is absent, right, in that event as well. So in this talk, I'm also only going to share the career stories of 3 engineers from the 2 projects. So by no means are they stories representative of the experiences of all people who I have talked to, but their stories do help me illustrate the social, cultural, and socio-material relations and the power dynamics that are enabling as well as disabling, if you will, for immigrants to become significant players in the process of knowledge transfer. So I'm going to share some stories here. And just to mind you, all the names that I use, I'm using are pseudonyms, but they're also names popularly used in the cultures where the respondents came from, at least according to my Google search. If there's anything wrong, we can go back to Google and take another look. So here's the story of Ava. Ava was born and raised in Iran, received her Bachelor of Sciences in Mechanical Engineering in 1991 from a well-known technical school. She was among 3 girls in the program and the only one who graduated from the program. She then worked in Iran as a mechanical engineer and was promoted to be a department head. Came to Canada in 2002 with her family, learned in 40 days that it's almost impossible to get a job in Vancouver because there's no car manufacturing industries here. Husband went back home to work so as to provide for the family. And she, on the other hand, attended a computer-aided design program, trying to become a designer. And she sent her resumes to multiple places and did not get interviewed until she anglicized her name. And this is a story that I heard again and again in my conversations with old immigrants. Now, then she was hired by a small geological company as a draft person. And she was, later on, she learned that she was given the chance because the company knew that she was overqualified, and then she would be an advantage to the company. So at work, she kept on proving herself through identifying errors and problems and proposing effective solutions. And she managed to cross over to geology through self-directed learning and became the technical lead of a team of geologists and mining engineers. So when the company got into financial trouble during an economic recession, she was the last person to let go. But she left the company with a minimum package because she had no contract with the company, although she had tried to negotiate one. Now, at the time of the interview, she was in a career limbo because her experiences working in geology cannot be counted or used for her to apply for the professional designation as a mechanical engineer. And she said, in order for me to go back to mechanical engineering field now, it's double hard. So I'm considered a seasoned engineer, and yet I'm not a professional engineer. Now here is the story of Ling. She was born in China, received her Bachelor of Sciences in 1994, and then Master of Sciences in 1997, both in electrical and electricity power system. And she was the first female to get a Master of Science degree in her program at her university. And her first employment as a junior engineer was with the largest power utility company, and she was the first female who was offered this position. She was initially eager to work, but got discouraged by the monotony of work and the lack of opportunities for career growth. So she decided to go and study abroad and received multiple offers and came to Canada as an international student because she received a scholarship from NSERC, which is a federal funding agency for research and student training in natural sciences and engineering. Now, during her graduate program, she was a main player on a team that designed and programmed a type of a dynamic analysis software, which is now popularly used in North America. She is currently working in a leadership position in a large utility company, overseeing operations and being responsible for capital projects and making decisions in emergency situations. And she said, being a woman, being an Asian woman, a minority, working with professionals of like over 6,000 employees in such a big company, and I'm able to lead a team and people respect me. She was very confident and proud of herself, of being able to earn the respect from her team. Now, Cosmin is originally from Romania. I just noted that on the map, the indication of country of origin is drawn there, but he obtained his bachelor in electrical and in electrical engineering and master's in mechanical engineering in Romania. So originally from Romania instead of South Africa, but he got his PhD in electrical engineering in South Africa. He was actually the oldest respondent that I ever talked to, and 74 years old. And due to political turmoil, he moved to Germany in 1990, then to South Africa in 1992. In 2006, he and his wife followed their daughter to Canada. So in Romania, he worked as a principal researcher, and in South Africa, he held managerial positions. Now, prior to moving to Canada, he was already interviewed by a major engineering company in Canada. He chose to work in energy efficiency and conservation. In 2018, he founded a consulting company. Now, in the interview, he related a few significant contributions to the engineering fields, especially when it comes to standardization in energy use and regulation of electronic devices. He said, in emigration, I have been able to float and swim, swim and float, and then I started creating. Now I really want to zero into the key knowledge events that they shared by focusing on the main and sociocultural and socio-material relations that are constitutive of those events. Now, learning is a theme threading through immigrants' experiences. They all demonstrate an incredible ability of learning to learn in many of the knowledge events that they shared. Often they undertake a self-directed learning projects to familiarize themselves with Canadian codes and standards, keep up with the development of their fields out of professional interest, to be inducted to local practices within their new workplaces, and challenge confirmatory exams. Majority of them did, so as to qualify for the PN designations, and then finally in relation to the needs arising at work. Now, to illustrate point 5 here, perhaps, in the case of Ava, her company needed to estimate the resources of a mining site, and yet it did not have the math ready. So Ava volunteered to build the model, although she was not a mining engineer or a geoscientist. She came up with the model in a month. And as a matter of fact, she said she did not know how to build this model, and it wasn't easy, but she knew it was possible. She said the only thing was time and patience to spend on it. Many details to take care of, much technical knowledge to learn, and which I was willing to learn. I was willing to put that time and effort into it. What supported the success was also, according to her, a fresh eye and a willingness to get a good result. She said that was my only advantage. The rest was all up to me. I had to learn to compete with them. So Ava's narrative shows a strong professional habit of learning to learn and to expand her knowledge and practice repertoire, which is a common theme across cases. So many of the respondents shared that they took pride in their capacity of learning to learn. It, however, will be erroneous to reduce learning as a remedy for deficiency. As Ava's case shows, that their learning has also contributed to the expansion of existing professional practices. So in other words, learning and knowledge transfer are two sides of the same coin in many cases. And what holds those two aspects in the same practice is a comparative lens that immigrants often introduce to the object matter. Perhaps I can give another example. So in the case of Cosmin, he was part of South Asian Bureau of Standard, and he, with the recommendation of his colleagues, he became a member with the Canadian Standard Association, CSA, in 2007. And when he was learning and familiarizing himself with related standard, he came to know that repairing electronic motors, for instance, in Canada, was organized based on best practices rather than sciences. Now, as someone who's trained to be a firm believer in sciences and scientific evidence, and during the interview, he was definitely teaching us, giving me and my research assistant a lecture on the importance of scientific knowledge. And then he decided that it would be important to bring change, which prompted a major professional endeavor for him. Now, non-human beings or things are ever present in all the significant events that respondents shared. And those objects include, but are not limited to, engineering design, blueprints, engineering codes, protocols, manuals, research papers, textbooks, machinery, and computer software. These objects are instrumental in bridging immigrants across differences in the organization of engineering work and profession. And on the other hand, immigrants also constantly bring in codes and standards and research from other parts of the world to expand engineering practices in Canada. So in the case of Cosmin, he managed to introduce benchmark of energy at risk to Canada, which extended his work which was an extension of his work on power at risk in South Africa. Now, the idea of such a benchmark is based on his recollection that regulators can ask manufacturers to be energy efficient, but only to a certain extent due to the laws of physics. So by proposing benchmark for energy at risk, he tries to make it also a consumer's responsibility to be conservative in their daily consumption of energy. So note the introduction of the benchmark brought together different worlds. Now, to start with, the benchmark serves as a boundary object between the industry and the society. So Cosmin said, you can read the quotation on the slide. Now you can develop this concept in the society, so you can take the law of physics away, which we did in the industry, and introduce it in the commercial sector. So what he is trying to say here is that he developed this idea based on the law of physics, which is a logic accepted and used in the industry. And the public does not need to follow this particular logic, but they would modify their energy use according to him, modify their energy use behaviors, given their need to be economical and to save energy. Now, in the meantime, the benchmark concept is also an epistemic object, translated and transformed at the same time. When discussing the development of this idea, he said, in South Africa, when you do something, you need power because there's not enough power. And I explained to my colleague this concept of power at risk. And because in Canada, everything gets energy costs and stuff. So we said, okay, let's name energy at risk because all the bills are on energy. So the power is not a problem here. So in other words, the concept of energy at risk is already a translated concept as Cosmin and his colleagues try to make it relevant to the Canadian context. Now, the case of Cosmin also shows that where immigrants make a significant impact, there are typically professional others involved in the event. In the account of many immigrants, particularly women and immigrants of minoritized backgrounds, peer professionals, especially those who are more senior and more established, play a role in involving them in expensive practices. Now, in the case of Ava, the mechanical engineer from Iran, she was working as a drafter person initially in the geology company. But she managed to become the technical backbone of the company. And she attributed her success in part to the trust and sponsorship of a supervisor. She said, my supervisor was the designated person responsible for quality control. Although I wasn't a geologist or mining engineer, he would sign off on my work because he would trust my data. But of course, there was a process involved for her to gain the trust from the supervisor in the first place. So given this trust, when Ava volunteered to develop the geological model, the turning point of her career in the company, most of the colleagues were in doubt, but she said the supervisor was willing to give her, the opportunity and take the risk on her, and gave her the time to work from home, and then she just produced and delivered at the end. Everyone was flabbergasted. Now, the significant events that the respondents spoke about also shows the strives and struggles for immigrants to translate themselves within engineering practices. So when relating their contributions to the profession, they spoke about not only knowledge and skills and ways of doing, but also personal and professional habits, such as adaptability, work ethics, and cognitive dispositions as engineers, which underline their professional conducts. And additionally, to bring the self forward, some immigrants reported negotiating their positionalities and social identities in terms of race, ethnicity, and gender. So I'm going to give you quite a few examples here. So Cosmin is one of the keenest people to bring changes to how engineering conducts its business in Canada. So when promoting a science-based standard, in contrast to the use of best practices for a type of electronic devices within a professional society, he was considered an intruder in the conference room. So he said, I presented this standard. Guess what? They asked me who I am, where I'm coming from, what is my background studies. They try to figure out actually if they can put me down because of my background, but now asking about the color. But later on, he said, I'm too old to give up. So in response, Cosmin shut everything down and left the room. But he kept on providing evidence about the need for evidence-based standard until it was taken up initially by his colleagues, and then professional organizations in Canada, and eventually by professional associations in other places. Now, negotiating their positions within a field dominated by men was more of a challenge for the women engineers. So earlier, Ling took pride in being able to command respect from her team. She continued, I'm very lucky because I got lots of support, but I also realized nothing comes easily. You need to learn, you need to earn the respect. Sometimes people can really challenge you, but how are you going to earn your respect? So to earn the respect, Ling said her strategy is to be a hard worker and willing to help others, and to make sure she has very good communication skills. And most importantly, she said that she would need to show her team her capacity in crisis situations to be able to lead a team of men. Similar to Ling, Ava worked hard to lead and supervise more than 8 professional and geologists as a non-geologist who, according to her, were all fighting her. They asked her, who are you? You have no designation. And she said, right from the beginning, I was a fighter. I always would work harder to show what I'm capable. And it was my personality. And she related that she got oral recognition and reinforcement from the leadership, which helped to better position herself vis-a-vis resistance at work. She worked particularly hard on her communication. She took 2 courses in professional pronunciation and paid a linguistic expert to work on her accent, with the hope that reduction of that accent would give her an edge. Now, while the leadership gave her verbal recognition, such recognition never materialized. For 2 years, she tried to negotiate a labor contract, and yet the management would always budge and dodge the question and not answering her. So she could have taken, she said she could have taken the matter to the court, but eventually she decided not to. So she consulted a lawyer, and she said, at the end, I leave everything in my power, even my financial gains, not to make it a dispute. First off, it was against my value. Secondly, I thought professionally it would be a suicide. So again, when the company was downsizing and eventually evaporated as a company, she left with a minimal package offered by the company. That was during an economic recession. So I'm now moving to the last part of the talk, and just a few discussion points here, perhaps. Now, while the focus of the talk is knowledge transfer and translation by immigrant engineers, and the object of analysis in the paper is not knowledge per se, but knowledge practices, particularly the practices that are enabling for immigrants to translate the distinctiveness and differences in terms of knowing, doing, and being in the engineering profession. So I think my work has both theoretical and empirical implications, especially when it comes to in the area of knowledge transfer in the context of migration. So theoretically, it challenges the traditional image of knowledge transfer as a movement of knowledge across place. So by using the image of knowledge translation instead, I hope to open our eyes to the multitude of actors involved in the constitution of knowledge events, where different ways of knowing, doing, and being become knotted. And the importance of this process-oriented approach is that it may help point to multiple points of intervention and interruption. And also, while social identities are rarely the focus of research on knowledge transfer, which conjures an objective image of knowledge practices. So my proposal centers history in person in the formation of individual actors and actions, which make it possible to address knowledge practices in relation to the historical struggles of marginalized groups. Empirically, just a few points and to wrap up. So empirically, the career stories of immigrants show that immigrant engineers tend to have high professional aspirations and drives and are adept at continuous learning. So the events of knowledge transfer that they shared also show that many of the practicing engineers are well-resourced, especially when it comes to engineering knowledge objects, which has to do with their connections and experiences with practice communities across place. Now, it can be argued that immigrant engineers are at a positional advantage to bring together matters, materials, methods, theories, concepts, and approaches from practices communities that are perhaps hitherto disconnected. So this positional advantage, I would say, constitute a potentiality that can be and has been mobilized to expand professional practices. Now, the opportunity for immigrants to translate their positional advantage, however, is contingent on the rise and their access to needs and problems at work. In some cases, people I talked to were given opportunities because of specific needs for language, cultural knowledge, a rare expertise, or a surge of needs for engineering labor. So in most cases, though, immigrants, particularly women and minoritized immigrants, suggested that the trust and sponsorship of a peer professional again, more senior, more established, was crucial for them to access opportunities to grow their careers. To a great extent, these peer professionals helped mediate their positionality and power positions in the profession, and in some cases amplified their impact within the profession. Now, identity struggles are ever present in the career stories that people told. Their struggles are not merely about moment-to-moment negotiation of the self in a new context. It also bears a mark of the history in person, often history etched with power disparities along relations of differences such as gender, race, and class. And some immigrants I talked to built their career lives through continuous struggles within the profession as women and as outlanders due to their social background. They have tried to remediate their social disadvantage through learning and through becoming better communicators and become more technical and better at what they do. So in my view, immigrants' capacity of learning to learn in Canada might be the biggest import for the country. But learning is a crucial means for immigrant engineers to negotiate positionalities and knowledge in the process of knowledge transfer. There is also the question of how much learning is too much. For instance, many made actual efforts to work on their English, taking English classes or paying language experts to reduce accents. Yet, none mentioned English communication as a factor or instrumental in getting them involved in particular knowledge events that were significant for them. As well, the reward for their labor learning varies, and sometimes they fell to the peril of their capacity of learning to learn. And in the case of Baba, given her interest and desire to solve problems at work through self-directed learning, she succeeded in crossing over to geosciences. And yet, this change also meant that she accumulated no experiences in Canada in her field of training, which is mechanical engineering. So as a result, she could not register either as a mechanical engineer nor as a geoscientist. And the fluidity of individual career pathway, in this case, conflicted with the career pathways defined and imagined by the regulatory regime for the engineering profession. So in other words, success in translating knowledge may not equate to successful translation of the of individual person to the profession. So I know my time is up, so I'm going to stop there. It's quite interesting to be talking this to the computer for just so long, but I think I'll stop and then we'll go to Q&A if there's any questions and comments and critiques.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Shan.
Yeah.
That was really insightful for me. Yes, we do have some questions we're going to go to. Now, I do want to return to Sheldon as the introducer in a moment, but I see first on my list here is Catherine Katie Entigar. Katie Entigar, do you want to ask a question?
Hi, Peter. No, I think we resolved this by email. I don't have a question. Sorry about the confusion.
Oh, okay. Okay, I'm getting used to that. Thank you. I'm gonna defer. I'm gonna use my privilege as a moderator to pass it over to Sheldon to ask a question if he would like, because I know he's done some extra reading in preparation for his introduction. And Sheldon, would you like to ask a question of the keynote?
Sure. Thanks so much, Professor Shan, for your presentation. Very insightful and interesting. And I'm just curious, in your talk, you mentioned that you draw on 2 research projects for your paper. Could you share why you used those 2 research projects? And also, how did you select the 3 stories you shared in your talk as well?
A great question. Thank you, Sheldon. Now, yeah, I thought about this for a long time. So as I mentioned, the first project was focused on professional learning. I really wanted to understand what enables people to learn, to navigate, and to grow professionally. And then in that process of doing research, I find the learning itself doesn't capture fully people's experiences. As people learn, they're also producing knowledge and they're innovating practices, which is the reason I applied for the second project, trying to understand people's knowledge transfer experiences or contribution in the area of knowledge transfer. So the two projects are interconnected. As I'm trying to articulate a coherent proposal knowledge transfer as translation, I think, I'm still working on this conceptual proposal there. I'm trying to bring together learning and knowledge transfer from, not only, I know work has been done in this area, but I'm more hoping to bring in socio-material theories to the conversation and dialogue there. So the reason that I chose to draw on data from both, in part because of the stories that I heard. So the three people I selected, as I mentioned, they don't speak of the experiences of everyone, but they're the story that stayed with me and gave me the best, the most profound impression, lasting impression. They show the kind of struggles and different ways people struggled in the profession. So in part, they are my favorite stories, but they are not representative stories. The reason that I chose those three is also because their experiences speaks of the many of the themes that we identified, my team and I identified in both studies, and they also speaks of the irony of learning. So learning and knowing, and sometimes learning is considered as the way for immigrants to earn their respect, to earn their recognitions. But learning itself can be, contradictory to the purported agenda or goals associated with learning. So those are the reasons behind the choice. But I could have just used one project for this study itself. It's really the stories. I think it's more of a personal choice in this case.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer and the question, Sheldon. I want to sneak in a question myself, but first, next on my list is Michael Bernhard. Michael, can you pose your question, please? Oh, you need to unmute.
Okay, I hope you can hear me again.
Yeah.
Now I unmuted and muted again. Well, first off, thank you very much for a very interesting, inspiring presentation. I wonder, you talked about learning and knowing being two sides of the same coin, and I like that image. And you talked a lot about the practices in which knowledge is being translated. And I wonder whether you also looked at how learning or ways of learning are being translated. Early on, you talked about the tacit learning, formal learning, and I wonder whether individuals moving through different spaces where all the different epistemologies might be dominant, whether you also found differences in not just learning to learn, but also learning different types of learning. And can you speak to that perhaps? Thank you.
That's such a good question. And Michael, good to see you in a conference again. So yeah, types of learning. maybe I can go back much earlier. So when I started out looking at people's learning experiences, I was looking at transformative learning theory, experiential learning theory, and then I encountered practice-based learning. So when it comes to learning, it's in part about framing and also about articulation of people's experiences as well. So when it comes to framing, theoretical framing, there has been a journey that I traversed, I have to say. So after reviewing all paradigms or theories of learning, I was not entirely satisfied. So in part, my question is, how come learning is transformative at this point and then experiential at the other? And, so, and then the image horizon, I think someone from South Korea also wrote about this, looking at how learning itself is a rhizomatic process. So, it doesn't have to transformative and at this point and experiential at the other points. It's really an existential happening, and it's not restricted to the framework that we impose. So that's a theoretical note on the side. Now, in terms of ways of learning that people have demonstrated in the study, I have to say, lots of them. This is something that's really important to perhaps share. So lots of them are very self-driven and demonstrate incredible ability of self-directedness when it comes to learning, right? They are very good at getting at the resources and that are needed to solve the problem at that they have at hand. So they're connected to, now I'm more thinking in the image of practice-based learning. So they're connected to practice communities, but what is missing? So when I conducted situated analysis, I also started looking at, what is missing from the picture. So they talk about practice communities, but they're not well connected to communities. So they're connected to the practice rather than communities per se. So that's perhaps a challenge for them. Like they are learning, but very much in isolation, although in connections to the epistemic communities. So in terms of ways of learning, I don't see the shifts, like I haven't paid attention to the shifts in ways of learning, but I do notice some particularities or patterns in that can be a little bit unsettling when it comes to their learning ways of learning, right? It's not that they don't want to get connected with other communities. It's like learning itself is taking over their life. So to a great extent. So I guess I'm not, responding to the question directly, but those are some of my observations. But it's a good thing to, I know that Stephen Billett yesterday talked about, historical transitions that people have to experience today in their life course. It'll be interesting to address how their ways of learning have changed. Thank you for the question.
Yeah, thank you very much for both the theoretical and empirical observations to that question. We appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. The next questioner is Kiran Merchandani. Kiran, could you pose your question?
Yes, thank you so much for that really incredibly insightful, detailed, talk with so much content. I'm really happy to see how you've been working and developing these ideas. My question really, I guess, relates somewhat to your very early work, where I think one of the things that you were really talking about was how project-based work within engineering, like hiring on temporary short-term contracts, provided limited employment stability for many of these, for many in this profession generally. So I kind of was interested in whether you found or what you're thinking in terms of how the terms of employment affect how engineers' knowledge is transferred or can be transferred.
Such a great question. Thank you, Kieran. Kieran's my professor at OISE, and I always get stumbled when she poses a question, and it's happening to me again. Yeah. So yeah, that extremely important context for my study is the working conditions of immigrant engineers. Indeed, project-based and term-based work is very common. Contract-based work is very common, not only for immigrant engineers, but for all engineers. So when you look at their learning experiences, again, you know, I talk to not only women, but also men and people. I talk to people from developing and developed world who came as immigrant to Canada. So negotiating opportunities and access to problems at work, or you know, because engineering projects are often organized around problems, a problem that they address. So they do learn how to negotiate access within access to problems or project. And some of them, you know, if you talk about learning, some of them would become more performative in how they communicate themselves, like earning the respect, earning their trust, and asking more questions, asking questions to demonstrate who they are, basically, or what they know, what they could do. Those are the, you know, sort of, if, you know, just going back to Michael's question just now, if you think about how learning shifted, I think that's probably an important shift for many people, because some people are not used to sort of marketing themselves while you are already at work. So I think when it comes to, you know, knowledge transfer, this performative dimension of their learning is something new for many immigrant newcomers. And then I also had cases where people took this performative type of learning to an extreme, and they will be using this culture to compete within the engineering community, right? You know, by trying to demonstrate themselves. Some of them would manipulate or would play this culture to say, hey, I'm better than you, right? There's this mentality of competition. So you know, going back to my observation of, you know, lack of community. So many people I talked to also expressed a sense of competition and the urgency, or how competition itself is complexing, making their life more complex and make their learning more deliberate, but also problematic at the same time.
Yeah, so just to quickly, very quickly, sorry, Peter, to follow up, Shan, in typical fashion, you first say you're stumped and then give a brilliant response. But I also just an observation that your comment really leads me to think that this is such an important setting in which to examine how racism actually works by pitting groups against one another. So just, you know, comment in terms of how the environment and context and terms of employment almost seem to bring that kind of competition about. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. And then you, the question about racism, it's huge. So when I was talking about knowledge transfer, like we're reading literature on knowledge transfer, so what strikes me is that, you know, people seem to be operating in a world that's devoid of power differences and you know, historical disparities across groups. But when I look at the literature, and you know, given my research with immigrants and yours and everyone else, social differences matters to a great extent in people's experiences. So when in my research, I do ask the people, have you encountered racism? And I can tell you, 1% of them, like out of the 122 people, perhaps only just a few people responded by saying yes, and other people try to brush it off. So, but then they gave you lots of examples of how they were being treated differently. They try not to use the term of racism, and so, you know, as a way of I guess developing coping strategies at work. The same thing with women; they wouldn't talk about sexism. But then they give you lots of examples of how important it is for women to demonstrate or to mentor new women engineers. And there were many examples where they say, you know, because nowadays I'm talking to more senior professionals, and they will tell you, right, one of my contribution is that I really helped, you know, younger women engineers to establish themselves better within the field and help them to become more confident, because I've been through that process. So, but to me, this is something that I'm trying to grapple with, right? Apparently, there are cases of, you know, at least a discomfort and struggles, but then they don't use the language of racism or sexism, and I'm trying to, you know, come to a coherent understanding of why that is the case. But yeah, thank you, Kieran.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Thanks for the answer. That's really helpful. Are there any other questions people might have to pose before we're just kind of have a few more minutes? I'm just going to give it a couple beats opportunity for people. And opportunity's gone. I'm going to ask my question. Shan, you briefly in one of your responses, you kind of touched on the idea of you know, themes of transition, life history dimensions of your research, and of course Stephen Billett's keynote presentation yesterday. I hope this isn't an unfair question, but if you had to, and you were put on the spot to talk about the you know, the parallels or divergence between some of the concepts he talked about or ideas, and how he goes about his research and how you go about yours, could you characterize it in just I don't know, not too much longer?
Yes. I do have to say, like in the middle of the keynote yesterday, I experienced a power outage, so I rushed home because my talk started at 3, so I didn't capture the entire conversation. But I think Stephen, Professor Billett's work is, you know, really inspiring, and I really like his you know, 3 mediators for people to manage their transitions. One of them is really around community. I think, you know, if you think of his notion of affordance, community is probably one source of one of the key you know, source for or structural for affordance. And I also like his elaboration of the notion of affordance itself, because affordance doesn't mean something that's always good, right? There could be contradictory or things that happen out of, you know, that are not so much expected. So that's something I really want to take away from the talk. And in terms of how my work is different from his, I think I really want to understand people's, well, first of all, when you talk about learning, you're creating a subject positions. I think that subject position is both a place of promise and a place of problem. So how we perceive individuals will have implications as to how we approach them in our teaching, in our research. So I do agree that we are all lifelong learners, but in the meantime, how do we come into our, you know, into the educational enterprise with more of an asset-based approach? I think by identifying the, you know, other roles that people play in the knowledge process, it could be really useful. So when you see people learn maybe they might be teaching you at the same time. So that's something I was thinking during the talk. And the other thing that I really want to, raise here is that, if you think of education, it's quite interesting, because education, from a Marxist or neo-Marxist perspective, education is there to perpetuate social differences. If you look at the social structure, it doesn't change that much. Longitudinal studies do show that however much you try through the educational system, eventually, working class may end up as working class led, right, doing working class jobs. So this is the structural issue need to be taken into consideration when we consider transitions. And so my way of approaching it, approaching this, is to perhaps to attend to the microcosm of knowledge events in my type of research. I want to understand that order is not predefined. It is his order. Social order is historical, but it cannot be predefined. It cannot be there to define people's pathways. And so, and the other thing is, it's really important to see that lots of actors that can be brought on board, and they are involved in the production of social order. So social order itself, I think, one of the most important contribution from a social material theories is really to understand how social order is the effect of the encountering of people from different places, as well as with different objects, things, theories. So in my research with immigrant engineers, like the theories, the research, they're the lifelines for them to emerge within the field. So it's really interesting to see that. So rather than just seeing communities and individuals in the life transition process, we also want to pay attention to what objects are perhaps surrounding us and how we are collaborating with those objects and to constitute knowledge and knowledge production process. So not sure if those comments are useful.
No, they're very useful, very clear. And I really appreciate, and there are some important distinctions that you made more clear for me. With that, we're out of time, and I want to officially bring this second keynote session of RWO12 to a close. I want to thank our speaker again. I want to thank our introducer. And I want to thank our questioners from the audience, and then the audience themselves for joining us. Thank you, Shan, and we'll bring this to a close now. Neil?